Good evening from New York. This is Monday, November 22nd, 715 days until the 2012 presidential elections. If we needed one final straw in the disaster that has been the TSA's choice, do you wish your privates felt up or photographed? We have two. Agents actually patted down a dog because it was wearing a sweater. And an al-Qaeda affiliate endorsed the new security system, in a sense, for causing exactly the kind of economic strain on America that it seeks, what it calls the strategy of 1,000 cuts. The message from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula referred specifically to a recent incident in which two bomb-laden printers from Yemen were placed on cargo planes when the intended destination of each, synagogues in Chicago. Even though the bombs were intercepted, the online message claims that, quote, "It is such a good bargain for us to spread fear that would cause the West to invest billions of dollars in new security procedures," calling it Operation Hemorrhage. This strategy of attacking the enemy with smaller but more frequent operations is what some may refer to as the strategy of 1,000 cuts. The aim is to bleed the enemy to death. We'll ask MSNBC terrorism analyst Roger Cressy if that is anything more than a desperate claim of an enemy that has largely been shut down. But law enforcement officials told ABC that the pat-downs are happening now in part because of al-Qaeda's ingenuity. And in response to the public outcry over the new screening measures, today the Obama administration announced tweaks to the procedures. Senior administration officials telling NBC News that the number of passengers picked at random for pat-downs has been reduced and that screeners have been told to be more sensitive. This after the embattled chief of the Transportation Security Administration, John Pistol, says that his agency was indeed willing to consider adjustments.
Clearly, there has been a significant concern raised with the traveling public, and members of Congress have expressed concern from their constituents and things. So, yes, we're going to look at how can we do the most effective screening in the least invasive way, knowing that there's always a trade-off that we talked about, that trade-off between security and privacy, and where, again, reasonable people can disagree.
On Saturday, Mr. Pistol had agreed to exempt the pilots from the body scanners. As for National Opt-Out Day, the call for protests on the busiest travel day of the year, day after tomorrow, Mr. Pistol expressed concern.
If people choose to opt out of the advanced imaging technology because they're trying to slow down the process, then I feel bad for the people who are simply, again, wanting to get home for the holidays, that they would be delayed because of that.
Meantime, the president has said that the aggressive security measures, quote, are the only ones right now that they consider to be effective against the kind of threat that we saw in the Christmas Day bombing, a reference obviously to the thwarted attempt by a Nigerian man to detonate plastic explosives hidden in his underwear on board a flight from Amsterdam to Detroit last Christmas. Amsterdam, where the TSA doesn't have any authority. While Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that she didn't want to second-guess security officials, there was also this.
But would you submit to one of these pat-downs?
Not if I could avoid it. No, I mean, who would?
Then there is House Speaker-elect John Boehner, who, because of his security detail, gets to bypass security measures as per procedures set by Capitol Police and the TSA. Boehner was escorted past metal detectors on Friday, while other congressmen had to pass through it. The rest of us must choose between the porno scanner or the pat-down feel-up, like Tom Sawyer, the Michigan man whose urostomy bag was spilled by a pat-down in Detroit. By the way, do you need any more symbolism here? They're abusing cancer survivor Tom Sawyer? Or the young boy who went through the secondary screening after setting off a metal detector, his father choosing to remove that boy's shirt to try to expedite the process. And then there is our frequent guest, Bob Kavnar, whose poodle did not set off the metal detector, but whose poodle was nevertheless selected for the enhanced screening because he was told his poodle was wearing a sweater. Let's turn now to MSNBC terrorism analyst Roger Cressy. Roger, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
And never follow an animal act.
I hate poodles, so that's okay.
So that's the first reasonable explanation I've heard yet.
Happy Thanksgiving.
The al-Qaeda claim, first off, in the al-Qaeda magazine, for God's sakes, that yes, our billion-dollar responses to each one of their $1,000 gimmicks is exactly what they want. Is that some sort of retrofitted claim to the fact that so many of their attempts have been thwarted, or is there a measure of accuracy in that?
Oh, absolutely. Look, they're going to spin it in a way that supports their narrative, and frankly, there is some truth in it. Whenever we overreact by just throwing an enormous amount of money at the problem, then they believe they've won a small victory. What it comes down to, it's incumbent upon us to view the threats that are out there, respond appropriately, but don't just trip over ourselves trying to over-architect a solution that frankly costs too much money and might not be that effective. This is not the case right now, though. We're dealing with a security versus privacy issue, Keith, that is the toughest we've had since 9/11, I believe. And we're trying to find where that comfortable middle ground is. And so far, TSA and the American public has stumbled a little bit in finding that middle ground.
And to the point of that, everybody gets a full body scan or a feel up or both. Is that necessary, and would it even detect the kind of things it is said to be detecting?
Well, it's actually not true. I flew out of Reagan National yesterday, and I didn't get that because I followed the same procedures that I've been doing since I started flying after 9/11. It only happens if you choose not, you get the pat-down if you choose not to have the body scan, or if something triggers either in the magnetometer or in the full body imaging. So, you know, you have to be consistent across the board for one important reason, and that is litigation. I mean, we talk about, well, maybe we only highlight those individuals who have the greatest risk, but unless you can come up with an approach that makes sense there, people are going to litigate left and right, and I don't think TSA or DHS wants to deal with that.
Well, and to that point, the alternative method that's used by the Israelis, which has really come into the spotlight in the last 2 weeks, they ask everybody at the airport a couple of questions, then pull out the ones who seem agitated. Proponents say that's human intelligence, and opponents say it's not fitted to big airports and it's racial profiling. Which is it?
No, I don't buy the racial profiling. I mean, we do profiling right now. TSA and DHS does profiling. It's called behavior profiling. They have behavior detection officers around a lot of major airports. You know, I love the Israelis. The Israelis do a good job. The Israelis have a problem that is so small in scale relative to us. They got a half a dozen airports. They got a fleet. El Al's got a fleet of 40 aircraft. I could interview every single passenger if that was the universe that I had to deal with. But our scale and volume is so much bigger. What we've done since 9/11 is employed a lot of the best practices the Israelis have. We've got canines, we've got these detection officers, we now got secure flight where we're using terror watch list matching that the government's doing instead of the airliners. All these things make sense, but as the enemy adapts, we need to be more creative in figuring out a solution that maintains that privacy versus security line, and this is where we got to do a better job. To TSA's credit, they've now said, all right, the pilots don't have to go through the same procedure because they are not a threat. And I think you're going to see other changes to the procedure in the coming weeks. But look, they should have done a better job thinking through some of these things before the rollout. They're going to try and correct it now, though.
Is there anything topical that perhaps is not generally known that makes this a good time to continue to do this? Or is that talk over the weekend in Germany about looking for potential bombers there, is that just a coincidence of timing?
I think that's a coincidence, Keith, but the point you made earlier about the ingenuity that al-Qaeda and others like it are now applying is something that makes a lot of people in the government and the intelligence community really nervous. I mean, the lesson we learned from Flight 253 is that we did not anticipate what Omar Farouk Abu-Muttalib was going to do. We did not come up with that type of approach. Now we got to get more creative in thinking through how they might adapt, how al-Qaeda might adapt to our security measures and be more proactive. The problem there, of course, is then you're trying to prove the negative with the American people. Yeah, we've got new measures in place, but trust us, this is adapting to the new threat. I think one thing that has to happen is the government's going to be a little more forthcoming in explaining the narrative of why this is such an intelligence-driven choice right now and why the threat has evolved. They got to do a little bit better job in that. I think by and large the American people will understand it.
MSNBC terrorism analyst Roger Cressy. Always a pleasure, Roger. Thank you.
You bet, Keith. Thanks.